that the greatest fortress of its time fell not only to enemy attacks, but also because of a secret its defenders kept inside. In 1291, the city of Acre was the last shining stronghold of the Crusaders in the Holy Land, a capital where wealth, despair, and the remnants of former glory mingled. It stood as a symbol of nearly 200 years of history, and everyone understood that if Acre fell, an entire era would fall with it. A powerful army of the Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil gathered at the city walls. These were not just warriors. They were a machine created to fulfill oaths and see things through to the end. Their goal was clear and ruthless: to expel the last Franks from the Levant, wiping their last outpost off the map. Tension inside the fortress grew with each passing day, and rumors of internal divisions among the knightly orders intensified the fear of the inevitable. Watch the video to the end to find out what secret technology the Sultan's engineers used to bring down the massive walls of Acre, why one wrong move by the knightly orders proved fatal, and how an era that had defined life in the Eastern Mediterranean for almost 200 years came to an end in a single day. What if I told you that just a few months before its fall, Acre was one of the richest and most prosperous cities in the world? This port city was not just a military base, but a true metropolis of its time, where East met West. Its harbor welcomed ships from Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and Constantinople, bringing European goods and taking away spices, silk, and precious stones. Inside the walls, life was bustling, filling the markets with noise and colorful fabrics. The city's architecture reflected its wealth and international character. Next to the austere fortresses of the knightly orders stood the elegant palaces of Italian merchants. The city was divided into quarters, each of which lived by its own laws and followed its own traditions. It was a melting pot of cultures where Franks, Syrians, Greeks, and Armenians lived side by side, and trade deals were made in dozens of different languages. This splendor was protected by the most powerful fortifications known at the time. Acre was surrounded by a double ring of walls topped with tall towers. From the sea, the city was virtually impregnable, its harbor protected by a massive chain and the mighty Tower of the Flies. This fortress seemed eternal, a symbol of the indestructibility of the Christian presence in the Holy Land. However, behind this facade of prosperity lay deep divisions. The Italian trading republics of Venice and Genoa were engaged in a fierce commercial war with each other, which at times escalated into actual street fighting. They were interested in profit, not unity in the face of a common threat. This internal struggle undermined the city's strength from within. The knightly orders, the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights, also acted largely independently. Each order had its own headquarters, its own fortress within the city, and its own political goals. They were the best warriors of their time, but often could not agree on a unified strategy. The Grand Master of the Templars, Guillaume de Beaujeu, tried in vain to reconcile them all. The city itself was overflowing with refugees from other fallen fortresses. These people brought with them fear and a sense of doom. They had seen other cities fall and understood that Acre was next on the list. This created an atmosphere of feverish excitement and at the same time hidden panic in the city. Meanwhile, in the south, in Egypt, a new power was gaining strength. The Mamluk Sultanate had united vast territories under its rule and possessed virtually inexhaustible resources. Unlike the Crusaders, the Mamluks had a single will and a single leader, Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil. The Sultan had a compelling reason for his campaign. Despite the truce, a group of Italian Crusaders carried out an ill-advised raid that led to unrest. The Sultan used this as an excuse to declare the end of all treaties. He vowed that he would not rest until the last stone of Acre was thrown into the sea. Thus, in the spring of 1291, the shining pearl of the Levant found itself in a stranglehold. On one side were internal strife and greed, on the other, an inexorable war machine marching to end an entire era. The illusion of security vanished like smoke when the first vanguards of the Mamluk army appeared on the horizon. The inhabitants of Acre watched in horror from the walls as the valley in front of the city turned into a huge military camp. Thousands of tents, hundreds of banners, and the glint of steel in the spring sun left no doubt. This was an army assembled not for plunder, but for a complete and final solution. We are very interested in hearing your point of view. Do you think unity could have saved the city, or was its fate sealed by the power of the Mamluks? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new chapters of great battles. Are you ready to learn the truth about the man who assembled one of the greatest armies of the Middle Ages for a single purpose? Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, ruler of the Mamluk Sultanate, was not just a warrior, he was the executor of a historic mission. His father, Sultan Khalil, began the task of expelling the Crusaders by capturing Tripoli, and now his son had to complete what had been started by taking Acre. The army he assembled was unprecedented in its scale and organization. Sources report tens of thousands of cavalrymen and an even greater number of infantrymen. This was not a feudal army assembled for a short period, but a professional military machine, paid for from the Sultan's treasury and subject to iron discipline. The Mamluks, elite slave warriors, formed the core of this force. A key element of Khalil's army was his siege equipment. The Sultan understood that the walls of Acre could not be taken by a simple assault. Therefore, he brought with him more than 100 huge siege engines, catapults, trebuchets, and mangonels. Each of these machines was a feat of engineering, capable of hurling stones weighing hundreds of kilograms over enormous distances. The operation to deliver this arsenal was a logistical miracle. The heavy machines were transported on dismantled carts, which required the construction of roads and the reinforcement of bridges. Tens of thousands of craftsmen, engineers, and workers accompanied the army, ready at any moment to assemble, repair, or even build a new machine on the spot. Sultan Khalil himself personally supervised the preparations. He was known for his determination, which bordered on stubbornness. For him, the capture of Acre was a matter of honor and religious duty. He had no intention of compromising or negotiating, as his predecessors had done. He had only one goal: the complete and final elimination of the last Frankish stronghold. Arriving at the city walls, the Mamluk army set up camp, which resembled a separate city in size. The camp was divided into sectors by regiments, with clear streets, markets, and even field baths. Discipline was strict. Any offense was punished immediately, because the Sultan understood that order was the key to success in a long siege. The Sultan's engineers began assembling siege engines as their first task. The defenders of Acre watched in horror as a forest of wooden structures grew up opposite each important section of the wall. The largest of these machines were given their own names and were directed at the city's most powerful towers, such as the Cursed Tower and the King's Tower. The Sultan's plan was simple and methodical. He intended to reduce the walls to dust. He was in no hurry to throw his warriors into an assault on the impregnable fortifications. Instead, he ordered a continuous, round-the-clock bombardment. The goal was to wear down the defenders, destroy their fighting spirit, and physically destroy the city stone by stone. The psychological effect was enormous. The roar of hundreds of machines merging into a single hum did not stop day or night. Huge stones flew over the city with a howl, destroying houses and fortifications. It was a war of attrition in which Acre, cut off from the world, had almost no chance. Realizing that the walls might not hold, the Sultan employed another tactic: sapper warfare. Special units began digging tunnels under the most important towers, seeking to collapse them from within. It was slow and dangerous work, but Khalil was in no hurry. He methodically tightened the noose. Have you ever wondered what happens to the morale of people living under such constant pressure? In the next chapter, we will learn that the main enemy of the defenders of Acre was not hiding outside the walls, but inside them. I will reveal to you the most closely guarded secret of Acre. While the Mamluk stones were destroying the walls from the outside, the city was being devoured from within by deadly enmity. If the defenders of Acre had been united, perhaps history would have taken a different course. But a fortress divided in two cannot stand. and Acre was the most striking example of this fatal division. The city was not a single organism, but a conglomerate of warring factions. Italian trading colonies, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, controlled entire neighborhoods. They had their own walls, their own militias, and, most importantly, their own fleets. These republics fought fiercely for trading privileges, and their enmity was so strong that the Genoese, for example, maintained closer ties with Byzantium than with their Venetian neighbors. During the siege, this disunity became fully apparent. Each faction was primarily concerned with defending its section of the wall and its commercial interests. Instead of directing all resources to the common defense, they argued over whose fleet should patrol the harbor and who would pay the mercenaries. This petty jealousy paralyzed the command. The knightly orders, despite their legendary discipline, were also divided. The Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights were the city's most professional defenders, but they were also major political and economic players. There was a long-standing rivalry between the orders for influence, land, and wealth. Guillaume de Beaujeu, Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was the de facto military leader of the defense. He was an experienced warrior and diplomat who desperately tried to unite everyone. He rushed between the Venetians and the Genoese, between the Hospitallers and the Templars, persuading, threatening, and calling for unity in the face of imminent destruction. But even his authority was not enough. When the Mamluk engineers began digging tunnels under the walls, a coordinated and rapid response was needed. Instead, long disputes began about who should provide soldiers for the sortie and who would dig the countermines. Every minute lost gave the Sultan sappers an extra hour of work. A striking example of this chaos was the arrival of reinforcements from Cyprus. King Henry II of Cyprus, who also held the title of King of Jerusalem, arrived with a small fleet. His appearance was supposed to boost morale, but it only added to the confusion in the command structure. The king was weak and indecisive, unable to assume the role of the unified leader that the city so desperately needed. Moreover, various factions tried to use the king for their own interests, dragging him into their petty intrigues. Instead of uniting around the crown, the defenders became even more divided, arguing about the legitimacy of his power and authority. This paralysis of power at the most critical moment became a death sentence for Acre. Ordinary citizens and mercenaries, seeing this anarchy, lost their last hope. They understood that their leaders were more concerned with preserving their privileges than saving the city. This led to a breakdown in discipline, desertion, and a general sense of doom that hung in the air along with the dust from the crumbling walls. Thus, the Mamluk army faced not a single fortress, but a collection of separate fortified quarters, each trying to survive on its own. Sultan Khalil, well aware of these divisions through his spies, methodically exploited them. He concentrated his attacks, knowing that help from a neighboring quarter might not come. If you enjoyed this unusual look at the siege, don't forget to like this video. What if I told you that the walls of Acre were considered the pinnacle of fortification art of their time? A true marvel of engineering. When the Mamluk army saw them, they were initially stunned. It was not just a wall, but a complex echelon defense system designed to stop any enemy, even the most powerful. The basis of Acre's defense was a double line of walls surrounding the city from the land. The outer wall was the first line of defense. It was tall and thick, with numerous towers protruding forward to provide flanking fire. In front of it was a deep moat that prevented siege engines from getting close. But the real pride of the city was the inner wall. It was even higher and stronger than the outer wall and was built to dominate it. Even if the enemy captured the outer wall, they would find themselves trapped in the narrow space between the two walls, under crossfire from the inner wall. This area was called the Zwinger, or killing field. Each tower on these walls was an independent fortress. The most famous were King Hugo's Tower, the Countess de Blois Tower, and the Legate's Tower. These monumental structures were designed by the best engineers in Europe and could withstand the blows of ordinary catapults. They were symbols of the city's power and wealth. However, the most powerful and at the same time the weakest point of the defense was the northeast corner. Here at the junction of the walls stood the so-called Cursed Tower, or Tormatet. It was a massive barbican that covered the gate of St. Anthony. It was at this defensive node that Sultan Khalil decided to direct his main attack. The Mamluk engineers immediately assessed both the strength and vulnerability of the system. They realized that a frontal assault would be suicide. Therefore, they deployed their heaviest trebuchets, such as the Victorious and the Wrathful, against this sector. Their task was not simply to breach the defenses, but to methodically reduce the fortifications to dust. The defenders, in turn, did not sit idly by. They used their own catapults, mounted on towers, to conduct counter-battery warfare. Day and night, engineers and masons repaired the damage, filling the holes with sandbags and wooden beams under a hail of stones. The sea was another element of defense. As long as the Crusader fleet controlled the harbor, the city could receive reinforcements, food, and, most importantly, had a route of retreat. The Mamluks, being a land power, did not have a strong fleet to blockade Acre from the sea, and this was the defenders' main hope. However, geography played a cruel joke on the city. The harbor of Acre was shallow and silted up over time. Large ships could no longer enter it and were forced to stand in the outer roadstead, which made supplies vulnerable to storms. This circumstance greatly limited the defenders' capabilities. Thus, Acre was an ideal fortress on paper, but with a number of fatal vulnerabilities. It was designed to defend against the armies of the past, but not against the new, high-tech, and ruthless siege engines of the Mamluks. The walls were strong, but the Sultan's will was stronger. What was the defenders' first response to this stone storm? In the next chapter, we will learn how the Mamluks used technology to bring down these seemingly eternal walls from within. The Siege of Acre in 1291 was not just a battle between people, it was above all a confrontation between engineers, a titanic duel between stone and wood. Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil brought an arsenal capable of striking fear to the city walls. It was not just an army, it was an entire industry of destruction, operating with frightening efficiency. The central place in this industry was occupied by trebuchets, or manjaniks. These were giant machines that worked on the principle of counterweight. Mamluk engineers perfected their design. The largest of them, such as al-Mansuri or the Victorious, had counterweights weighing several tons and could throw stones weighing up to 300 kilograms. These machines were not just cumbersome stone throwers. They were precision instruments that required the coordinated work of an entire team. Engineers calculated the trajectory, while hundreds of workers supplied ammunition. Perfectly hewn stone balls. The work did not stop for a minute, ensuring methodical and continuous bombardment. In addition to heavy trebuchets, the Mamluks used hundreds of lighter and faster-firing mangonels. These machines worked on the principle of tension and were operated by teams of soldiers pulling on ropes. They could not destroy the walls, but their task was to clear the upper galleries of the fortifications, preventing the defenders from repairing the damage and returning fire. The defenders of Acre watched this mechanized fury with horror from the walls. The noise was so loud that people could not hear each other. The air was filled with dust from the crumbling stone and the whistling of flying boulders. The psychological pressure from this incessant hail of stones was no less devastating than the physical damage. The Mamluk engineers waged their war methodically. They did not scatter their forces, but concentrated the fire of several dozen machines on one section of the wall, usually on one of the key towers. Day after day, week after week, they pounded the same spot until the stone began to crumble and the first cracks appeared in the wall. Incendiary shells caused particular problems for the defenders. The Mamluks threw pots containing a flammable mixture which, when broken, set fire to the wooden superstructures on the walls and roofs of houses. This forced the defenders to constantly fight not only against destruction, but also against fires, distracting their already meager forces. The defenders, of course, responded. They had their own catapults installed on the towers. However, there were significantly fewer of them, and they could not compare in power with the Sultan's armada. In addition, they themselves were the main target for the Mamluk archers. Any attempt at repair or return fire immediately attracted attention. Sultan Khalil also employed a new tactic. huge wooden shields or barricades, which were moved up to the walls. Under their cover, crossbowmen and archers could safely shower the defenders with arrows, while engineers prepared their machines for action. It was a complex, multi-level siege system. After several weeks of continuous bombardment, the once proud and impregnable walls of Acre began to change their appearance. Ugly breaches littered with debris appeared in place of the smooth stone towers. The Sultan's army of stones slowly but surely did its job, turning the stronghold into ruins, but the Sultan knew that bombardment alone was not enough. To ensure the city's fall, he employed another, more secret and terrifying technology. He decided to attack the walls not only from the outside, but also from underground. This was a job for the most experienced and desperate specialists in his army. Are you ready for the shocking truth about how the impregnable walls of Acre actually fell? While the army of stones shook the city from the outside, another quiet and much more sinister operation was unfolding beneath the feet of its defenders. Sultan Khalil threw his elite engineering units into battle. Sappers or nakabuns, masters of underground warfare. Their task was to do what the catapults could not do, bring down the most powerful towers from within. The principle was simple in concept, but incredibly complex and dangerous to execute. The sappers began digging a tunnel or mine at a safe distance from the walls, out of reach of enemy archers. This tunnel went deep underground, heading straight for the foundation of the chosen tower. The work was carried out in complete silence, with pickaxes and shovels in narrow, dark, and stuffy passages. The earth was carried out in bags, carefully camouflaging the entrance to the shaft so that the defenders would not guess what was going on. Upon reaching the tower's foundation, the sappers began to widen the tunnel, creating a large underground chamber. They literally removed the earth from under the base of the multi-ton structure. To prevent the tower from collapsing immediately, they propped up the ceiling of the chamber with powerful wooden beams and posts. When the chamber was ready and completely filled with wooden supports, the final team came into action. They brought combustible materials into the chamber: straw, resin, and oil. Everything was ready for the final act of this underground drama. Then the sappers set fire to the wooden supports and quickly retreated through the tunnel. The fire, burning in a confined space, burned through the supports. At some point, when the wood turned to charcoal, it could no longer support the weight of the stonework. The foundation lost its support. The inevitable happened. The huge tower, a symbol of power and impregnability, collapsed with a deafening roar and crashed down in a cloud of dust, opening a wide passage for the attackers straight into the city. It was this tactic that was the main threat to Acre. The defenders, of course, knew about this threat. They had their own counter-mining specialists. They tried to determine the direction of the enemy's tunnels by putting their ears to the ground or placing bowls of water to detect vibrations. Once they found a tunnel, they began digging their own, crossing the enemy's. When the two tunnels met, desperate battles unfolded underground in pitch darkness. But the Mamluks had an undeniable advantage. They outnumbered their opponents. They could afford to dig dozens of tunnels at once, confusing the defenders and dispersing their already small forces. The main target of the Sultan's sappers was the cursed tower and the adjacent sections of the wall. Day and night, while catapults thundered above, below in silence, the sappers methodically prepared for the fall of the city. This invisible war was the key to Khalil's victory. What did the knights do when they realized that the ground was slipping away from under their feet? In the next chapter, we will talk about the desperate attempts of the defenders to turn the tide of the siege. While the Sultan's engineers methodically destroyed the walls, the defenders of Acre did not intend to passively await their fate. They were warriors, and their response to pressure was to attack. The leader of this active defense was the Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Guillaume de Beaujeu. He understood that the only way to survive was to strike the enemy where it was vulnerable. The defenders' main target was the siege engines. These giant wooden structures were both the strength and weakness of the Mamluk army. Wood burns well, and Guillaume de Beaujeu decided to use this to his advantage. Daring night raids were planned with a simple goal: to break through to the catapults and burn them. These operations were carried out under cover of darkness. Elite units consisting of Templars and Hospitallers silently left through secret gates. They moved quietly, carrying torches and combustible materials. Their task was to slip past the guards, set fire to the machines, and return behind the walls as quickly as possible. The first such sorties were somewhat successful. The defenders managed to set fire to several siege engines, causing panic in the enemy camp. Each destroyed trebuchet gave the city a few days' respite. These were small victories that greatly boosted morale. However, the Mamluks learned quickly. Sultan Khalil reinforced the security of the siege park. Triple cordons were set up around the machines, and the moats were deepened. Each subsequent sortie became more and more risky and yielded fewer and fewer results. The warriors were ambushed and struggled to fight their way back. One such sortie by the Templars nearly ended in disaster. They successfully set fire to one of the machines but were cut off on their way back. They had to fight their way back, suffering casualties. It became clear that this tactic was no longer working. Guillaume de Beaujeu was in despair. He was a brave warrior, but he saw that his best men could not stop this ruthless machine. He even attempted negotiations, personally going to the enemy camp. But Sultan Khalil was adamant. He did not want a ransom, but complete control over the city. Despite the failures, the sorties continued, but now their nature had changed. These were no longer diversionary raids, but desperate counterattacks. When the Mamluks stormed the damaged section of the wall, the knights at the head of their troops rushed into the breach to repel the enemy. These moments were the peak of the siege. The warriors of the orders, encased in their armor, stood to the death trying to hold the line. Their discipline and training allowed them to briefly halt the advance of the Mamluks, but the forces were too unequal. For every fallen defender, the Sultan had 10 new fighters. The sea remained the only route by which help could arrive. The defenders looked hopefully toward the horizon, waiting to see the sails of a large European fleet. Small ships did break through, bringing food and volunteer troops, but it was a drop in the ocean. Ships were also used for attacks. Small flotillas attempted to attack the coast to distract the Mamluk forces, but the Sultan had so many troops that he could afford to assign an entire corps to defend his camp from the sea. All attempts by the defenders to seize the initiative failed. By mid-May 1291, the siege of Acre had reached its climax. Tension in the city grew with each passing day as the defenders realized that the Mamluk army had arrived with a clear goal: to destroy the last major Christian stronghold in the east. All eyes, both defenders and attackers, were fixed on one place: the cursed tower and the adjacent section of the outer wall, which were considered the main stronghold of defense in this area. It was here that the Mamluk engineers directed all their destructive power, because they understood that the fall of this point would open the way to the heart of the city. From that moment on, each day brought new destruction, and the defenders increasingly discussed whether Acre could hold out for another week. It was here that the outcome of the battle for the city would be decided. After several weeks of continuous bombardment and intensive underground work, the defenders began to notice increasingly alarming signs. Stone blocks, which until recently had seemed unshakable, began to shift and crumble under the blows of huge catapults. Huge cracks appeared in the walls of the tower, gradually widening as if the fortress itself were groaning under the enemy's blows. There were rumors that the ground beneath their feet in this sector was vibrating slightly, and these rumors only added to the growing anxiety. The counterminers worked to the best of their ability, listening carefully to the ground and trying to calculate the direction of the enemy's tunnels. But they could not intercept all the tunnels, as the Mamluks often changed the direction of the passages and worked at night. And then on May 15th, the fateful day arrived that many had feared, but still hoped to avoid. The Mamluk sappers completed one of the largest mine galleries, which ran directly under the base of the cursed tower. They set fire to the wooden supports holding up the arches of the tunnel, and the soldiers working along the entire line knew that the minutes until the collapse could be counted on the fingers of one hand. The defenders on the walls heard a dull rumble, as if something alive and terrifying was rising from the depths of the earth. Then the ground literally disappeared from under their feet, and many soldiers lost their balance. With a deafening roar, the cursed tower in a significant part of the outer wall settled and collapsed, turning into a huge pile of stones and dust. In a matter of seconds, a thick cloud of dust rose into the air, obscuring the destroyed section of the wall from view. It was so dense that even experienced warriors could barely make out what was happening ahead. In this cloud, which seemed to envelop the entire area, a huge breach formed where the powerful fortifications had once stood. Sultan Khalil's plan worked perfectly. Now nothing prevented the troops from breaking through. Without waiting for the dust to settle, elite Mamluk troops, specially trained for action in such conditions, raised a battle cry and rushed into the breach with a roar. Thus began the first and, as the attackers hoped, decisive assault. The defenders, stunned by the catastrophe, were initially disorganized and did not understand where the enemy was coming from. In the atmosphere of panic, many tried to get up after falling, searching for weapons lost when the wall collapsed. Through the dust and chaos, it was difficult to distinguish between allies and enemies, which only complicated the situation. However, the orders of knights accustomed to operating in the most difficult conditions reacted immediately despite the chaos. The Templars and Hospitallers, whose headquarters were nearby, quickly got their bearings and rushed into the breach, knowing full well that the fate of the city was being decided right there. Groups of knights rushed towards the enemy, trying to stop the flow of attackers. A desperate battle for control of the ruins began, where every inch of ground was covered in dust and blood. The Mamluks managed to break into the space between the outer and inner walls, which posed a serious threat to the defense. For a moment, it seemed that the city had already fallen and that resistance was about to be broken. However, the attackers encountered another obstacle, a second, higher, thicker, and more powerful inner wall, which they did not expect to take so quickly. Finding themselves in a narrow space that the defenders had prepared in advance as a killing field, the attackers came under heavy fire from crossbows and catapults from the towers and fortifications. This immediately slowed their advance and gave the defenders a chance to regroup. Guillaume de Beaujeu and the master of the Hospitaller, Jean de Villiers, personally led the counterattack, realizing that there was no time to delay. They knew that if they did not repel the enemy now, there might not be another opportunity. Their presence inspired the soldiers, who, seeing their leaders in the thick of battle, gathered their strength and fought with even greater fury. In the narrow space littered with debris, where dust mingled with the cries of the wounded, a fierce battle raged. Fighting shoulder to shoulder, the knights used every ledge and every piece of rubble to hold their positions for at least a few minutes. They managed to stop the first onslaught, pushing the Mamluk vanguard back to the breach. By nightfall, after several hours of continuous fighting, the Mamluks' advance slowed and then stopped altogether. The attackers, having lost many men in disorderly attacks among the rubble, were forced to retreat from the breach, leaving the bodies of the fallen behind. The defenders won a tactical victory, which was a rare relief for them in those dark days. However, it came at a high price. Many experienced warriors died, and the defenders' resources were rapidly dwindling. The breach remained open, and although it was temporarily barricaded with whatever was at hand, no one doubted that this was only a brief respite. Everyone understood that the next attack would be even stronger and better prepared. Moreover, during this counterattack, Guillaume de Beaujeu, one of the key leaders of the defense, was seriously wounded. When he was carried away from the battlefield, many knights felt real fear for the outcome of the siege for the first time in a long time. For the defenders, the loss of such a man meant not only the loss of command, but also the loss of the moral support that kept people on their feet in the most difficult hours. His wound was a terrible blow to the morale of those who remained on the walls. People whispered that if even such an experienced warrior had been taken out of action, then the enemy was indeed stronger than ever. This event marked the beginning of the end, although many still hoped for a miracle. Sultan Khalil was furious that his first assault had been repelled, despite the enormous effort and destruction. He believed that the fall of the wall should have led to the immediate capture of the city, and his anger was directed not only at the enemy, but also at his own commanders. He immediately ordered his engineers to widen the breach to make it wide enough for large troops to enter at once. Mamluk sappers began digging under the inner wall, seeking to repeat their successful tactic. Khalil also ordered the city to be bombarded with incendiary shells to increase panic among the civilian population and make the defenders even more nervous. The city was preparing for a second, even heavier wave of attacks. The city endured a torturous night filled with screams, fire, and the sounds of collapsing houses. While some residents and remaining defenders desperately tried to erect makeshift barricades at the site of the collapsed tower, others were already seeking refuge in the harbor, hoping for a ship that could take them away from the impending disaster. Torches scattered throughout the streets illuminated the faces of people, which showed despair and exhaustion. The cries of the commanders mingled with the cries of women and children who understood that time was running out. The defenders tried to maintain order, but they had less and less strength to do so. It became clear that Acre might not survive the next assault. The fall of the Cursed Tower and the incapacitation of Guillaume de Beaujeu broke not only the walls but also the will of many defenders. The most devastating blow to morale was dealt by the man who was supposed to be the symbol of resistance. King Henry II of Cyprus, the nominal ruler of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, decided that the battle was lost. Realizing that the next assault would be the last, Henry II decided to save his own life. On the night of May 15, he secretly made his way to the harbor with his court and personal guard. They boarded ships and sailed to Cyprus, abandoning the besieged city to its fate. This flight, which many regarded as an abdication of his duties, was a signal to everyone. When news of the king's departure spread throughout the city, panic ensued. Wealthy citizens and merchants who still had money rushed to the harbor, trying to buy a place on the departing ships. Discipline collapsed. Soldiers and mercenaries abandoned their posts on the walls to also try to find a way to salvation. On the morning of May 18, 1291, Sultan Khalil gave the order for a general assault. This time, the attack was carried out not only through the main breach, but along the entire line of the walls. To the deafening sound of drums and trumpets, tens of thousands of Mamluk warriors simultaneously rushed to the attack. The defenders remaining on the walls, mainly knights of the orders and the most steadfast citizens, met them, but the forces were too unequal. Wave after wave of Mamluks poured into the breaches. They climbed up siege ladders and pelted the defenders with arrows and flaming mixtures. The defense began to crumble. Sections of the wall changed hands, but there were too many attackers. They broke through into the city in several places at once. Street fighting began, but it was already a death throw. The city, which had held out for almost 2 months, fell in a matter of hours. The surviving knights and townspeople desperately tried to make their way to the harbor, but chaos reigned there. The ships were overcrowded, people were pushing each other, trying to climb aboard. Many of the departing ships, overloaded, sank right in the harbor. A small group of the most steadfast defenders, led by the new Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Theobald Godin, retreated to their last stronghold. It was the fortified headquarters of the Knights Templar, standing on the seashore and having its own access to the harbor. The Templars locked themselves in their fortress, hoping to hold out until help arrived or to negotiate an honorable surrender. They continued to fight for several more days, while the rest of the city was already completely captured. This last stronghold became a symbol of the end of an era. Sultan Khalil, having won a complete victory, had no intention of leaving this hotbed of resistance. He offered the Templars terms of surrender. They could leave the city with their weapons and sail to Cyprus. However, the agreement was broken, and the last defenders of the fortress met their end. With the fall of the Templar fortress, the siege of Acre was over. The city, which had been the capital of the Crusaders for over 100 years, ceased to exist. It was not just a military defeat, it was the collapse of an entire world. The fall of Acre on May 18, 1291, was not just another lost battle. This date marked the final and irrevocable end of the era of the Crusades in the Holy Land. Nearly 2 centuries of European presence in the Levant came to a tragic end. The city, which had been the last capital, the last hope, and the last symbol, had fallen. After capturing the city, Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil fulfilled his vow. He did not want Acre to ever become a springboard for Europeans again. On his orders, the methodical and complete deconstruction of the city began. Walls, towers, palaces, and churches, everything that made Acre great was systematically dismantled. The Mamluk engineers who had so skillfully destroyed the walls during the siege now just as methodically dismantled them stone by stone. The harbor was filled in so that ships could no longer enter it. The majestic city, the jewel of the Mediterranean, was reduced to ruins, a warning to anyone who dared to challenge the Sultan's authority.
Ready the ropes! It's coming loose! Lower it slowly now. Acre is lost!
News of the fall of Acre reached Europe belatedly, with surviving refugees arriving in Cyprus and Italy. The news caused shock and grief. Popes and kings called for new crusades, raised money, and delivered impassioned speeches. However, there was no longer any real political will or resources to organize a new large-scale expedition. The era had changed. European monarchs were much more concerned with consolidating their power at home, wars with each other, and economic problems. The idea of returning to the Holy Land gradually turned from a real political goal into an unattainable ideal, a rhetorical figure. For the knightly orders, the fall of Acre was a disaster. They lost their main goal and reason for existence. The Templars, having lost their headquarters and main function, soon fell victim to the French king and were disbanded. The Hospitallers moved to Rhodes, and the Teutonic Knights concentrated their efforts in the Baltic region. But their role in the Holy Land was over. It is symbolic that the last stronghold, the Templars' fortress, collapsed because of undermining. Just as sappers undermined the city walls, internal divisions, greed, and political intrigues undermined the very foundations of the Crusader states. They fell not only under the blows of the Mamluks, but also under the weight of their own contradictions. The legacy of the Siege of Acre is not only a story of heroic defense and brutal assault, it is a lesson in how disunity and an inability to compromise in the face of a common threat lead to disaster. The shining fortress, which had withstood many sieges, ultimately fell because its defenders were unable to unite. Today, Old Acre stands on the site of the once great city, but its medieval grandeur can only be seen in the underground halls of the Hospitallers and in the stories of chroniclers. The wind from the sea blows through the ruins that were once the last bastion of an entire era. The end of the Siege of Acre closed one of the most dramatic chapters in the history of the Mediterranean. It was a resounding and tragic finale, the echoes of which can still be heard today. The battle for the Holy Land was over. We have witnessed the fall of Acre, an event that not only destroyed the city, but also ended an entire historical era. This siege was the culmination of 200 years of struggle, demonstrating both the incredible resilience of the defenders and the ruthless power of the new Mamluk military machine. The history of Acre is a timeless reminder that even the most impregnable walls can fall if there is no unity within. What other great battles or turning points in history would you like us to cover in future issues? Perhaps you are interested in the fall of Constantinople or Hannibal's tactics. Write your suggestions in the comments, because you help us choose topics for our next studies. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new fascinating dives into the past.